Love history? Subscribe and explore the stories that shaped our world.
In the early 15th century, the Kingdom of France was a fractured, bleeding nation, torn apart by the brutal Hundred Years' War. The English, allied with the French Burgundian faction, had laid waste to the economy and claimed vast swaths of northern France. The French crown was in crisis. The Dauphin, Charles, had been disinherited by the Treaty of Troyes, leaving his people demoralized and his enemies emboldened. Yet, the salvation of France would not come from a seasoned general or a wealthy nobleman. It would come from a dull little village on the frontiers of civilization. Born around 1412 in the village of Domremy, Joan of Arc was the daughter of Jacques d'Arc, a modest peasant farmer, and Isabelle Romy. She was an illiterate girl who spent her early years spinning wool, sewing, and helping her father tend to the family's animals. Her mother provided her with a deep, unwavering religious education. Her neighbors would later remember her as a friendly, exemplary Christian child who loved to play and pray. But Joan's life was forever altered at the age of 13. In the quiet of her father's garden, at midday in the summer, she experienced something extraordinary. She testified that a great light appeared to her, accompanied by a voice. Soon, she identified these celestial visitors as the Archangel Michael, Saint Margaret, and Saint Catherine. Initially, the voices simply instructed her to be good and to attend church. However, as the English threat grew, the divine messages took on a terrifying, monumental urgency. The voices commanded her to leave her home, to drive the English out of France, and to see the Dauphin Charles crowned as the rightful king. For a young peasant girl, the task was unimaginable. "I would prefer to stay home and spin wool with my poor mother," she once lamented, "for this is not my station." Yet, bound by her profound faith and a vow of virginity sworn to her celestial guides, Joan knew she could not refuse.
Driven by divine mandate, the 16-year-old Joan traveled to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs in 1428 to petition the local garrison commander, Robert de Baudricourt. She demanded an armed escort to the royal court at Chinon. Initially, Baudricourt was dismissive, harshly rejecting the peasant girl's ridiculous program. But Joan was unyielding. "It is important that I be at the king's side," she declared, adding, "Better today than tomorrow, better tomorrow than later." Her unshakable conviction slowly won over the townspeople and two of Baudricourt's own soldiers. Yielding to the pressure, the commander finally granted her a horse and a small military escort. To protect her modesty and ensure her safety while traveling through dangerous enemy territory, Joan cut her hair into a bowl shape and donned men's clothing, a practical, albeit highly controversial, decision she would maintain for the rest of her life. When she arrived at Chinon in early 1429, the 17-year-old maid faced a skeptical Dauphin. Charles VII, unsure of himself and his claim to the throne, decided to test her. He hid himself among his courtiers, dressed incognito. Unfazed, Joan immediately identified him in the crowd and approached him, boldly announcing her divine mission. In a private exchange, it is said she revealed the details of a solemn, secret prayer Charles had made, convincing him of her authenticity. Still, the royal council required absolute certainty. Joan was sent to Poitiers to face a grueling 3-week examination by a panel of theologians. They questioned her faith, her visions, and her purity. When a theologian from Limoges mockingly asked what language her voices spoke, Joan sharply replied, "Better than yours." The clerics found no fault in her. They declared her to be a good Catholic, pure in motive, and recommended that Charles utilize her to lift the agonizing Siege of Orléans. Equipped with plate armor, a sword from Sainte Catherine de Fierbois, and a battle standard of her own design, Joan the Maiden rode to war.
In late April 1429, Joan arrived at Orléans. The city was completely surrounded, its citizens starving and verging on surrender. The French army, after almost a century of defeats, was deeply demoralized. But the sight of the young maiden wielding her banner on the battlefield instantly sparked a renewed, almost fanatical hope. Joan was not merely a figurehead, she was an aggressive and brilliant motivator. She frequently clashed with the French commander, the Bastard of Orléans, who favored cautious defensive tactics. "In God's name," Joan rebuked him, "the counsel of my lord is safer and wiser than yours." She drove the French forces onto the offensive. On May 4th, her sudden appearance on the battlefield rallied retreating soldiers to capture the fortress of St. Loup. A few days later, on the morning of May 7, the Armagnacs attacked the main English stronghold, Les Tourelles. In the thick of the brutal fighting, Joan was struck by an arrow between her neck and shoulder. Refusing to yield, she returned to the front lines to encourage the final victorious assault. The very next day, the English abandoned the siege and retreated. The impossible had been achieved in just 9 days. Joan did not let the momentum die. She urged the French to aggressively pursue the fleeing enemy, leading to the Loire campaign, where bridge towns like Jargeau and Beaugency were swiftly recaptured. This culminated in the Battle of Patay on June 18, 1429, where the French vanguard decimated the English army, capturing their leaders and shattering the myth of English invincibility. With the path now cleared, Joan insisted on marching deep into hostile Burgundian territory to the city of Reims. The advance was nearly unopposed, and on July 17, 1429, Charles VII was consecrated and crowned King of France. Joan of Arc stood proudly at his side, holding her banner, weeping tears of joy. She had accomplished her mission. The tide of the 100 Years' War had officially turned.
The glory of Reims, however, marked the beginning of a tragic descent. Following the coronation, King Charles opted for cautious diplomacy over military action, signing temporary truces with the Burgundians. Joan's aggressive push to retake Paris failed in September 1429, during which she was wounded by a crossbow bolt in the leg. Her influence at court began to wane. In May 1430, acting without explicit royal permission, Joan led a volunteer force to defend the town of Compiègne. During a failed skirmish outside the city gates, she was pulled from her horse and captured by Burgundian troops. The English, viewing her as a massive political threat, rejoiced. They negotiated a ransom of 10,000 livres and transferred her to their stronghold in Rouen. King Charles, the man she had crowned, made no documented effort to save her. Joan was subjected to an inquisitorial trial led by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a partisan supporter of the English. The trial was entirely politically motivated. If the English could prove Joan was a heretic or a witch, they could invalidate Charles's coronation and legitimize their own claim to France. The proceedings were a mockery of justice. Contrary to church law, the 19-year-old was denied legal counsel, chained in a secular military prison, and guarded by hostile male soldiers. For months, she endured grueling interrogations by dozens of seasoned theologians. Yet, the illiterate peasant girl displayed astonishing intellect and prudence. When they tried to trap her by asking if she knew she was in God's grace, a question where either a yes or a no could condemn her, Joan brilliantly replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." The interrogators were left stunned. Unable to prove witchcraft, her captors weaponized her appearance. Joan was charged with blasphemy and idolatry for wearing men's clothing. Exhausted, threatened with burning, and shown instruments of torture, Joan momentarily broke. On May 24, 1431, she signed an abjuration, renouncing her visions and agreeing to wear women's dresses. But the tragedy was far from over. Kept in the same military prison, witnesses later testified that Joan was subjected to mistreatment and attempted rape by the English guards. To protect her chastity and realizing she had betrayed God out of fear of the fire, Joan deliberately resumed wearing men's clothing a few days later. Cauchon immediately condemned her as a relapsed heretic. On the morning of May 30, 1431, Joan of Arc was led to the old marketplace in Rouen. She was tied to a tall plastered pillar. As the flames rose around her, she asked for a cross. An English soldier handed her a rough one fashioned from sticks, which she placed against her chest. She fixed her eyes on a processional crucifix held high by a sympathetic priest, continuously invoking the name of Jesus until she breathed her last. She was 19 years old. As she died, even her enemies wept, with one man crying out in the crowd, "You have burned a saint." The fire consumed Joan's body, and her ashes were cast into the Seine River to prevent the gathering of relics. But they could not extinguish her memory. Joan's military triumphs had permanently shifted the momentum of the war. 22 years after her death, the English were driven from France almost entirely. In 1450, Charles VII, whose crown was secured by her sacrifice, finally ordered an inquest into her trial. This evolved into a massive rehabilitation trial authorized by Pope Calixtus III. Inquisitor Jean Brehal oversaw the hearing of 115 eyewitnesses, from her childhood friends in Domremy to her brothers-in-arms. On July 7, 1456, the court officially declared the original trial unjust, tainted by malice and deceit. Joan's condemnation was nullified, and her name was cleared forever. Over the centuries, the Maiden of Orléans transcended history to become an immortal symbol of female heroism, patriotism, and unwavering faith. As early as 1429, the poet Christine de Pizan celebrated her in the Dita de Jeanne d'Arc, praising the young woman who accomplished what the greatest heroes of antiquity could not. Later, during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era, she was resurrected as a symbol of the invincible French spirit. In modern times, historians and medical professionals have endlessly debated the source of her visions. Some have attempted to diagnose her with everything from epilepsy to schizophrenia. Yet, as modern psychiatrists conclude, no medical diagnosis can account for the astonishing intelligence, physical fortitude, and charismatic leadership she displayed. Joan defies our earthly categorizations. She transcended the rigid gender binaries of her era, wearing a soldier's armor not out of vanity, but out of divine necessity and absolute devotion. In 1909, she was beatified, and on May 16, 1920, nearly 500 years after she was burned at the stake, Pope Benedict XV officially canonized Joan of Arc as a saint of the Roman Catholic Church. A simple peasant girl, a visionary, a warrior, a martyr. Saint Joan of Arc remains one of the most extraordinary figures the human race has ever produced, a blazing light in the darkness of history, whose courage continues to inspire the world.